Good afternoon, members. Our first briefing today is going to be from the Department. It's an update on age discrimination legislation in relation to goods, facilities and services. Our second briefing is on the Executive's response to the PEDU report on the 2012 flooding. And our third substantive bit of business is to consider the responses we've received to our short inquiry into the Barroso task force, and those responses, I think, are very nearly complete. We've had apologies from Jimmy Spratt and from Bronwyn McGann. Any others? No? Okay. Members, page 5 of your pack, we have a request from AgeNI and the Age Sector Platform in unison here. They're asking the committee formally launches their joint age sector position paper on age discrimination in goods, facilities and services. This is based on the views of over 130 older people across Northern Ireland, sets out the sector's view of the steps necessary to ensure the proposed law affords older people the highest protections against age discrimination. The letter states it would be happening on the 8th of May or before then. The question, members, is whether we would be content to formally launch the position paper for them. I suppose my concern is, while it's a programme for government commitment, I wouldn't want us to be seen to be endorsing every last comma of a position paper. But that, that can be worked around. We can welcome the effort, look forward to studying in detail the contents, make clear we will be the scrutiny committee when the legislation is published. So there's a concern, but it's manageable as I see it.
Does endorsing it or launching it mean that we then endorse that position?
No, that's what I'm saying. We have to be clear that in launching it, we are not endorsing the paper. And because it's a programme for government commitment, I think it is possible to welcome the effort and look forward to studying it as part of our scrutiny of the legislation when it comes forward. So there would have to be
it's a fine divide, isn't it?
That distinction. Anyone else have concerns or feel that concern is prohibitive?
Yeah, no, I would share the same concern I've outlaid, Chair, but I think that there is a way around it, and I'm happy with that.
Okay,
great.
Yeah, Megan, happy enough?
Yeah, and as long as that's made clear from the outset. So obviously there's no agreement on scope yet. So
yeah, yeah, and it is specifically to older people, and I think that's an area where we're all agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Page 7, members, is a copy of our current invitations. Turning to page 3 of table papers, a response to our request for a briefing from junior ministers advising us, due to diary commitments, they'll not be able to attend on 30th of April or 7th of May, and we will be contacted with regard to rescheduling. In the absence of comment on that, we move on to the draft minutes of our meeting of the 9th of April 2014. That's from page 9 in your pack. Are we content to agree the draft minutes, members? Great. Thank you very much. Matters arising, beginning at page 17, we have a response from the Department which gives us a copy of the executive summary of NISRA's evaluation of District Council Good Relations programmes. The letter states the evaluation was completed in August 2012, and all 29 recommendations have been accepted by the Department. Any comments? If not, page 33, you'll find a response from the Department which gives further information following the briefing on the International Relations Strategy which we received on the 26th of March. Again, I'll pause for comment. In the absence of which, next is page 36, where we have a response from the Department to our request for comment on the Court of Appeal decision regarding the Commissioner for Complaints and Financial Redress. The response advises that as we are taking forward legislation, the committee may wish to clarify the powers of the NIPSO in this regard. So they have, I think probably quite rightly, sent it back to us as the authors of the proposed legislation. Content with that? Mm-hmm. Thank you. Page 38, a response from the Department to the Committee's request for comment on Fermanagh Trust correspondence in relation to community energy through the Delivering Social Change framework. OFMDFM have a project team in relation to proposals aimed at boosting economic activity through retrofitting in homes. The response also states that in relation to community energy, that DSD is responsible for the third sector, so they may have more information on this. So, are we content to forward this response to Fermanagh Trust and recommend that they liaise with the Department for Social Development on the issue?
Agreed.
Thank you. Page 41, a response from the Community Relations Council, providing a copy of its response to the Department's consultation on the Good Relations Indicators. I suggest we content to note that.
Yep.
Page 50, a list of outstanding correspondence. And you can see, members, there's been a huge bite taken out of that list. So we commend the clerk and the Assembly Liaison Officer, who seem to be doing good work on that. Thank you very much. Page 55, in correspondence from the Commission for Victims and Survivors, providing a link to its draft Equality Action Plan and Disability Action Plan. These are out for consultation until the 2nd of July. Page 55, copy of letters from a number of environmental NGOs to OFMDFM. These are in relation to the transfer of funds for the next Northern Ireland Rural Development Programme, which runs 2014 to 2020. Page 60, copy of a response from the Department to the Committee of Enterprise, Trade and Investment in relation to Barroso desk officers. And page 62, a copy of a response from the Department to the Committee for Enterprise, Trade and Investment in relation to its request for clarification on the pension fund investment. Page 64 is a response from the Department to the Committee for Education, who wrote on 14th of January, 1st of February and 7th of March in relation to clauses 3 and 34 of the Education Bill. Page 65 is correspondence from Playboard advising of its Let Us Play campaign. Correspondence advises it will be undertaking a range of activities aimed at highlighting the campaign and would welcome the opportunity to brief this committee. Do members have any thoughts on accepting a briefing, either in person or in writing? Could I suggest, with no strong views, we ask for a written briefing in the first instance, at least? Yep. Thank you. And page 67, you'll find correspondence from the Business Office advising us the annual report and accounts for the Maze-Long Cash Corporation for 2011-12 and 12-13 have been laid, and the Committee Office has a copy of those reports. As we now move on to our first briefing of the day, this will come from departmental officials on age discrimination legislation regarding goods, facilities and services. I would ask you to note the Department has not provided any papers for this briefing, a briefing that was scheduled for the 19th of February, but rescheduled at the Department's request. What we do have for you at page 69 is the Clerk's brief, providing background. Also included, you'll find a copy of the Programme for Government Commitment and a copy of the joint paper by the Commissioner for Children and Young People and the Equality Commission on this issue. You'll remember the committee was briefed on the 2nd of April by Nikki, the Equality Commission and the Commission for Older People, and we also had a brief from the Children's Law Centre. So, can I invite to the table Patricia Carey and David McGowan, please. Aye. Who's making the...
I am.
Patricia, you're making the opening address. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to brief the committee today on aged goods, facilities and services legislation. As the committee will know, there's already a significant body of legislation here that outlaws discrimination in the employment sphere, and there's also a significant body of legislation that outlaws discrimination in the provision of goods, facilities and services and other non-employment matters. The biggest single gap in this framework of equality legislation relates to discrimination of grounds on age in the provision of goods, facilities and services. And so extending age discrimination legislation to this area would fill that gap, but it's a very complex area. So Minister's intention is that the proposed legislation will prohibit treatment that amounts to unfair discrimination without removing any of the protections and privileges currently available to different age groups. So already there can be discrimination that serves a positive purpose, and the intention of this legislation is to make sure that that doesn't undermine that in any way. So to achieve this, we're examining various exceptions that will be needed to ensure that appropriate differential treatment for members of various age groups can continue. And when ministers are satisfied that a full suite of policy proposals has been developed to achieve the intended outcome, we will submit our proposals to full public consultation. It's our view that OFMDFM has an excellent record in ensuring that groups who are affected by legislation are consulted appropriately, and we would hope to continue that good relationship in any consultation on this legislation. Individuals, businesses, service providers, lobby groups, Section 75 groups, people affected by the legislation will be able to have their say. And we'll ask people to think carefully about the effects the proposals might have, and we'll be asking them to tell us if our proposals are the right ones, and if they're not, how they should be changed. Junior ministers in particular have met on several occasions now with the Children's Commissioner, with the Equality Commission, with Robin Allen, who also gave a presentation to this committee, and to various other people to discuss the legislation. So we've already begun that engagement in that way. The meeting with the Children's Commissioner and the Equality Commission was extremely useful and productive, and a number of options are now being considered as a consequence. We're also discussing with other departments the implications of the legislation, and a presentation was made to the Delivering Social Change Programme Board on the 9th of April, and obviously all departments are represented on that board, and follow-up discussions and meetings with officials in departments are now underway. So I'm happy to take any questions you might have. I should have introduced myself. I'm Patricia Carey, and I have responsibility for equality and human rights matters in the Equality, Human Rights and Social Change Division, beg your pardon. And David McGowan is a member of our team working on legislation, including age, goods, facilities and services.
Okay, thank you very much. Patricia, you mentioned there about the record of the department in terms of consulting.
Yes.
Could you just repeat or say exactly what you were saying about you felt you had a good reputation?
Well, that's what I said. It's our view that we have an excellent record in ensuring that groups who are directly impacted by the work have the opportunity to know about this and to contribute their views, and that we would seek to discuss widely with groups any policy proposals, and it would be our intention, once a consultation document has been developed fully, to have those ongoing discussions.
If you're applying that to the department as a whole, I just have to say that, for example, we ran a stakeholder event upstairs on the 6 signature projects, and one of the main criticisms was that stakeholders had not been consulted, and that the signature projects suffered because of it.
I'm sorry to hear that. In terms of anything that's within my own personal knowledge and my own personal areas of responsibility, it would be my view, and I think I did say it, but it was my view, that we have good and positive working relationships with people, but we are obviously always seeking to improve that.
Yeah, I would certainly accept there could be a distinction between your department and what you're doing, and perhaps what's happening elsewhere in the department. I'll not ask you to comment on
I wasn't
colleagues.
actually making that distinction, but
I am, I think, probably in your favour. We were advised in February that officials were to discuss the potential implications of age GFS with departments over the next few weeks, quote unquote. Are those few weeks up?
They are, and we haven't made just as much progress as we would have liked. We did have a good discussion at the Departmental Programme Board on Delivering Social Change. where some of the implications of the legislation were discussed. That's a high-level meeting with grade 3s from the various departments, and we thought that having that audience on these particularly significant proposals to people who have a wide range of responsibility in departments would be the best way to start that off, with then follow-up meetings with frontline delivery people and policy people developing the policies closer to the delivery of the services.
So why haven't you made as much progress as you would have liked?
Well, in terms of actually facilitating the meetings, we have had some discussions. We thought that it was better to wait for that initial meeting to kick the process off. So really, we're looking for nominations and making sure we talk to the right people in departments, and we're not sure we have identified those people yet. So it's more partly to do with just facilitating it and actually making sure we're talking to the right people, because the legislation has potentially significant impacts on departments and in the way they deliver their services, and that can be quite a wide range of people. So it's maybe not just moved as quickly forward as we had hoped it would have done by this stage.
From what you're saying, would it be fair to say that you're pretty close to the starting line in terms of this process?
I wouldn't say that, no, because although we're starting to engage in a round of discussions with departments, it'll be continuing conversations that we've had over the months and years that this project has been a PFG commitment. So many of the issues have already been flagged with departments. Departments have already identified for us the legislation that they have in place that might be affected by this legislation. So a fair bit of preliminary work has been done, and this latest stage of consultations with departments is to really inform fully the consultation document then that will go out for public consultation. So again, it's taking full advantage of all the work that's been done so far, making sure that it's up to date, but also making sure that departments are fully aware of all the implications of the legislation and connecting with people who maybe weren't there when the initial discussions were taking place.
When was this meeting with the grade 3s?
It was on the 9th of April.
9th of April.
Yes.
But your letter in February said that you were going to spend the next few weeks in discussions.
That had been the intention, and given that there was a Delivering Social Change Programme Board scheduled for April, and given that it was absolutely critical to get people at a senior enough level in the departments to really take note of this, a decision was taken to have that first meeting when at the next meeting of the Delivering Social Change Programme Board. So a paper was developed for that, which took advantage of the time available then to point out some of the implications of the legislation. So it was a good and informed discussion, and that does have representatives from the departments at a senior level who are already involved in these kinds of issues. So on balance, it was felt that that was a better way to proceed than to try and get a one-off meeting when diaries are very, very difficult, and it can be quite hard to get that creative person in the room.
That sounds to me like that was a change from what you told this committee in February.
No, it was a different way of getting the departments together. The intention had been to have a quick meeting with the grade 3s and then have them identify people in departments to actually go and talk to about some of the detail and get specific nominations around that. And again, when we thought about the logistics of that, and given other commitments and diaries of people at very senior levels, it was felt that really using an existing forum would be the best way forward.
Right,
and unfortunately, the next meeting wasn't until the 9th of April, so that did push that back, I accept.
Okay, but what you're saying to us is that, as I hear, is that this meeting on the 9th of April with the grade 3s was basically about logistics. Who are you going to appoint from your department to be the point person?
No, I apologise if I've given that impression. A paper was prepared that looked at some of the issues, that built on some of the work that had been done before, and the intention of that was really to ensure that people at a senior enough level in the departments were aware of the implications of this legislation and started thinking about it in terms of not just their functions but how they were delivered.
Okay, what were the issues?
Well, some of the issues were around the fact that, for example, one of the exceptions or one of the ways of dealing with discrimination claims or discrimination issues in any piece of anti-discrimination is to have an argument of objective justification. So if, say, for example, Health wanted to have bowel cancer screening for men over 50, the argument for that would be justifiable discrimination because somebody in that age group was more likely on the basis of clinical need to need that kind of intervention or that kind of screening. So the discussion was around providing some kinds of examples and some kind of issues to allow people to look at what they were doing and to understand more fully what the implications of the legislation are, because age is different from many, many other pieces of anti-discrimination legislation in that there isn't the easy comparators that there might be gender, men, women, transgender and sexual orientation, lesbian, gay, bisexual. So age, it's difficult to get a grasp of what it might mean in practice. Does it mean 40 as opposed to 60? Does it mean 25 as opposed to 55? So it was to get departments to start to think about these in a focused way, given that there was a consultation document that was really going to bring all the key issues together. So although some of those discussions had taken place already, and although departments had been appraised of the issues and there had been discussions, it was to make sure at this critical point in the process that those people at a very senior level knew what we were talking about and also then were well placed to look across their areas of responsibility and think about just what the impacts might be, and then as a consequence to identify who in those areas might be the best people for us to talk to.
See, at certain points, Patricia, I'm hearing you saying, we're just building on all the good work that we've done over the past months and years. But at other points, I'm getting the impression that you're starting with a blank sheet and let's draw up a schedule of these areas where there would be a legitimate ground to have a distinction.
I can see why you would think that. I think because it's so important that when we go to consultation that we look at all the issues properly and make sure that decisions aren't taken ahead of a proper public consultation, that we revisit with departments the issues, that we make sure that it's clear that this legislation is going forward and that there is going to be an impact on them. It's a refreshing rather than a starting with a blank sheet, and it's because we are getting to the stage where it's going to make a huge difference in terms of the responses we get to a consultation will depend very much on how well the issues are rehearsed and reflected and discussed in the consultation document. So given that we're moving to a stage now where the next step would be following approval by ministers on a suite of proposals that we would move to full consultation, it's important that we re-engage really with departments to make sure that all of the information we have has been updated and that the current people in post and that any are reflected and the current people in post are fully up to speed with what's going on. But equally, there may well have been developments in the roles that departments play and the services they provide, so to make sure that all of that is captured.
When you go to consultation, is it your desire that you would have a fairly comprehensive schedule of the sort of issues where it would be just a we have a new member. Sorry about that. It's somebody looking for another committee, obviously. When you go to consultation, is it your expectation that you'll have a pretty solid schedule of the sort of issues where you could have a justifiable exemption? Or are you taking an attitude that let's get out there and let the public and stakeholders tell us what should be on that schedule?
It would be a combination of both. I think what we would be proposing to do would be to, in the consultation document, highlight the areas where there might well be good reason for either objective justification for a decision to discriminate or indeed the need for a general exception that might take out age-related holidays, for example, that might take out giving free bus fares to people of a certain age. So again, We have done quite a bit of work to look at what those potential exceptions might be, and we've looked at legislation in other places, including in Great Britain in the Equality Act 2006 and the follow-up legislation that they produced on aged goods, facilities and services. So we have identified areas that might well be accepted because there's already discrimination on policy issues, and we might well want to incorporate those. Ministers in the Executive and the Assembly might want to incorporate those into law, but also testing some of the objective justification arguments, because in any piece of anti-discrimination legislation that covers public authorities, account has to be taken of the fact that there are limited budgets, so we can't possibly provide the services to everybody that we would want to do. So again, objective justification on the basis of clinical need has to be a primary consideration, and the same would apply to the functions of some other departments. So again, it's getting the balance right between not wanting to have a piece of legislation that was with more exceptions than content, but also that ensured that any exceptions were justified and that the public and representatives and groups and others were content that that was the way we were to proceed.
One of the examples we were given when we had the previous witnesses in front of us was a young person perhaps being put on an adult ward in a hospital.
Yeah.
And I think we all get it that that's far from ideal, and it would be much better if the child was on a children's ward.
Yes.
But there's huge resource implication,
Yes.
as you're hinting there.
Yeah.
How does that work in practice?
Again, it depends very much how the legislation is written. I mean, in any anti-discrimination legislation of this nature, the intent would have to be clear, and the remedies would be that a person could bring a claim of legislation of anti-discrimination or discrimination to a tribunal, and a tribunal would then take a decision, or a court. And often judges are loath to interfere with government functioning as it should and being allowed to make decisions around budgets and interfering with ministerial and executive and assembly responsibility. So some of it would be covered by that general principle that hopefully the objective justification and the exceptions would ensure that there wasn't interference with allowing government to operate. In terms of that specific example, again, it might be that, two main outcomes. If it did get to a court situation, that a court would find that there had been discrimination, and then action would have to be taken to ensure that there was provision made for children to have facilities that were children only, or indeed that a decision might be taken that there was justification, and justification had been made on the basis of objective need or other considerations, or in terms of exceptions that might cover areas where that situation would arise. So again, that's a very, very good example, and one that would be really explored and tested fully in terms of the consultation.
Okay, well, let's stick with it, because I'm sure we would all like to think that a doctor or a hospital administrator would have the humanity and the common sense to say, a young person is going to not go onto an adult ward inappropriately.
Yes.
But if there isn't the space, and the option is put this young person on an adult ward or don't treat them at all,
yes,
perhaps clinically the better decision is put them on the adult ward. But this legislation could leave a young person with the ability then to take a case.
yes.
Okay, let's say they take a case and they're successful. Does this mean that the health minister is going to be told, even though this happens once in a blue moon, you're going to have to build another children's ward?
Well, I think it's,
and resources.
Sorry. And identifying that kind of example and then testing that through this kind of process, obviously that's a really valuable scrutiny role that the committee plays, and actually then looking at how we draft the legislation and to think about, well, in that situation, what is the outcome that we want, so that if we want the outcome to be that the doctor would be able to place the child in the adult ward so that the child could be treated, and that was in the best interest of the child, then we would ensure that, or as far as possible, ensure that the legislation was drafted to allow for that. One of the protections, or one of the safeguards that would be our intention to build into this legislation is that any existing age limits in legislation that's currently on the statute book would be not affected by this legislation. So again, if there are already decisions that have been made on the basis of age and that's in statute, then that won't be affected by this legislation unless decisions are taken and following consultation and scrutiny that wouldn't be the case. So that allows for need and existing legislation to be taken into account, but also in the example that you give, it allows for those kinds of issues to be tested and for the real intention of the legislation then to be looked at and thought about, so that rather than have that outcome after the tribunal or the court case, that we could build that in, so that actually the decision on how that one would go could, as far as possible, be taken through the actual drafting and presentation of the legislation.
I suppose I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm wondering to the extent to which, if the legislation was in play and it was being used on these sort of cases, that the Health Minister could find that his or her hands were actually tied, because any available resource, and we know there isn't really any available resource for health, would have to be directed to satisfying court decisions based on this legislation.
Do you want to?
I think sort of, in essence, you're correct, that decisions or cases will invariably be brought before the courts and tested. And in many cases, the courts will obviously give a decision. How the decision is actually enforced then will clearly be a matter sort of for departments to decide. But yes, issues will come before the courts in a range of areas and will be tested.
It raises the question, do we as legislators want to have our legislative programme dictated by the judiciary?
Absolutely not, and that's why consultation and full consultation and exploration of these issues is absolutely critical. And the basis on which the legislation, for example, around children is already taken forward is the best interests of the child. So again, there's nothing that would be brought forward in this legislation that would conflict with that kind of approach. So again, invariably some of the law gets tested through court decisions, and rarely can anybody predict exactly what the outworkings of legislation will be. But the thing to do is, as far as possible, ahead of time, to make it as robust and as clear as possible. And as part of that process, and in line with other pieces of anti-discrimination legislation, there would be quite a bit of work done with the Equality Commission in particular, who have a statutory role in this respect, to provide codes of practice or guidance that actually makes clear what the impact of the law would be. And given that those would be worked up in the same kinds of timescale as consultation and developing the actual legislation itself, that's another way to test how some of these issues would work out. But in any piece of legislation, there's the potential for consequences at some stage down the line that weren't exactly intended by the legislation. And in terms of disability, there are some very famous examples of that, where the government in the disability discrimination legislation, the UK government intended indirect discrimination on grounds of disability to be covered by the legislation. In court it was decided that wasn't covered, so the government brought forward new legislation. So even in cases where you would like to think that you could have every example covered and could ensure adequate protection for people, and even when the intention of government is to have that protection, even with that, sometimes that's not how it works out in practice.
Okay, before I bring Mr. Maskey in, I think you've hinted you're off the starting line on the journey towards getting consultation published.
Yes.
What's your timeline? When do you think you'll publish consultation?
We don't have a definite date yet, because we're still using the meetings with departments and working up the policy proposals. So I can't actually give you a date today, but I can certainly take that back and see if we can provide a better estimate than I'm able to give you today.
Would you accept many will find that disappointing?
Obviously, people are anticipating this legislation being brought forward. As I said at the start, it fills the biggest single gap in the equality legislation here, so I think people seeing as much progress as possible will be obviously how most people will what they'll be looking for.
Thanks, Maskey.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks very much, Professor David, for your availability here today and your presentation. Could I mean, I'm coming at it from a different angle, because I'm from where our parties are. We want to see young people under 18s included in the legislation. So from that point of view, I want to sort of put a couple of things in, and it's fairly simple in one way. You've already covered an element of it, but would the department not consider that just a blanket exclusion of everybody under 18? But I mean, does the department not consider that to be discrimination in its own right?
Well, no decisions, as you will know, have yet been taken on that issue. There are different ways to tackle discrimination, and it doesn't always have to be through legislation. So the fact that legislation is being brought forward would obviously open up the debate and would require examination of who was being included and why. But there hasn't been age discrimination legislation in goods, facilities and services here for a long time. There wasn't age, goods, facilities and services legislation in GB, for example, the Republic of Ireland, and in fact there's very few administrations around the world that actually do have age, goods, facilities and services legislation. So that in itself doesn't mean that those people are necessarily being discriminated against. So I think there's always a view to be taken on how best to address discrimination, and one way is to do it through legislation, but there are other means of doing it as well, and I think that is one of the things that will be tested through this process.
Thanks, Professor. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I fail to see how we can have anti-discrimination legislation once you introduce it, that you don't include others. And for me, I just cannot fathom how a department could then argue that you can just blanket exclude a section of the population. So I mean, you've given your response and I appreciate that, so I'm just giving you our response to that. In terms of, and you've already covered part of this, in terms of if we bring forward legislation to deal with this issue in its entirety, you're quite clear, I think, in your earlier response that doesn't usurp existing legislation that protects parental responsibilities, for example, and some of the stuff that the Chair has maybe referred to earlier on. The last wee point I wanted to make, so I'm just saying, I mean, I'm just putting on the record, I think you've already made that point. Yeah. In terms of Section 75 duties, which obviously takes on board young people as well, and you referred then early on to the consultation processes. I mean, I don't think the Section 75 process or the screening I'm not aware, but could you maybe elaborate on the extent of the department's work on that?
Obviously, any policy, any legislation is screened for Section 75 impacts, and where appropriate full equality impact assessments are carried out. We're aware of that, and obviously we have been thinking very much around the equality impact assessments and compatibility with Section 75 as we would in any policy area. But because final decisions haven't been taken, and because all of the policies haven't been fully worked up, we're still in the process of screening. So obviously a final screening document which would accompany any consultation document would look at all of those issues, but obviously what goes into the screening document will very much depend on what goes into the policy document. So we're very much aware of our Section 75 responsibilities, and we are taking those into account in our development of proposals. But no equality screening has been finalised yet, or indeed no full EQA has been completed yet, because we're not yet at a stage to do that.
I mean, that's the point, and I do appreciate the answer, but I think it's important to probe anyways from where we're coming from. Mm-hmm. I mean, there has been consultation which you yourself have said has been very good. I can't imagine that it hasn't come up in the consultation thus far. So at what point is the department going to actually, because this is about a chicken and egg situation here. I mean, when you're considering something as high level as this, there's been a fair amount of work done and discussions in the department. So I feel like we can't understand why the department can't say, well, we're actually going to do this, or we're not.
Representations have been made on a range of issues, and compatibility with Section 75 and the impacts on particular groups. All of those issues have been made very strong arguments have been made to ministers. I mentioned earlier that the Children's Commissioner and the Equality Commission have already made representations. The Children and Young People's Commissioner and the Equality Commission have commissioned an opinion from Robin Allen, QC, who gave a presentation to this committee, and that very clearly set out some of the issues around equality generally in Section 75. So the issues have been identified and brought to ministers' attention. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Because no decisions have yet been taken on what should go into a consultation document, they inform where we are at the minute, but they do no more than that at the minute, and the extent to which there is an issue will depend, obviously, on what the final decisions are.
Just one final point, Chair. I mean, again, I think you're valiantly giving an explanation there, but it doesn't address the issue for me. I'm not suggesting you can actually finally do that. In fact, I'm quite sure you can't. But again, I'm putting on a record on behalf of our party. I feel to see how it has been presented to the department. You've got legal opinion provided to yourselves. Why does the department not then seek its own opinion on that? I mean, as I say, you may not and probably can't answer it, but I think it's important for us to put on a record. It's bizarre and, for me, unacceptable.
Well, there are different opinions about how this whole issue should be taken forward. I mean, an argument has been presented that not all jurisdictions have discrimination of this nature, and, as I said earlier, policy interventions can deal with issues as well. So there hasn't been a full equality impact assessment, a full screening of the policy implications, because decisions haven't been taken. But, and obviously Robin Allen's opinion, he's a very eminent QC and a very able and informed person. But equally, there will be others from the legal profession who won't necessarily take that view. So again, we are using that to inform what we're doing, and we are taking advice on issues as they arise from both the Departmental Solicitor's Office and from the Office of Legislative Counsel, because we would do that as any piece of legislation is being developed. And where there is a need, and I think you can have no doubt that appropriate opinion will be taken, and that any decisions that are taken will be in full knowledge of what the legal implications are.
Can I just say that, I mean, I'd like to thank you for your responses here, and I do appreciate the difficulty that you're actually in as an official, but I just think that once we're down, I want to put it on the record, I mean, once you go down the line of saying we're going to hopefully introduce anti-discrimination legislation, that you're going to consider blanket banning a certain age group, I just can't find acceptable in any shape or form, and I can't get a response to that. And respecting your own limitations in this.
This is a ministerial issue.
But I'm putting on the record on behalf of Sinn Féin that it's not acceptable that we don't even have the Section 75 obligations carried out at this point in time, whenever it's clearly staring in the face that you're likely to discriminate against. They're not even actually identifying. I mean, I haven't been given one example of where there could be a policy decision could negate the need for legislation, for example.
It's on the record. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Chris Little, Deputy Chair.
Thanks, Chair. I appreciate you've answered questions in relation to timescales already, but I mean, in terms of a far end of the timescale, I presume that there is an aim to deliver the legislation in this Assembly mandate?
Yes, there is, and given all of the various stages, we have satisfied ourselves, and ministers are satisfied that that still is possible. Obviously, there's quite an elaborate process for any piece of legislation, and there is time between now and the end of the mandate to bring forward this legislation, and it is still the minister's intention to do that.
Okay, and were you able to follow the evidence session of the committee with the relevant commissioners?
Yes. That
took place? Some of the, I felt like we were actually getting into some of the detail and some of the discussion around parental rights versus children's rights, and how best to word some of the potential exemptions that might need to be delivered. Have you any opinion in relation to those types of issues, or can you update the committee of progress that the department is making in relation to those issues?
I think in any anti-discrimination legislation, it's important that any exceptions are as narrowly construed as possible, and that would be in line with European law and with human rights, a human rights approach, because obviously nobody wants to allow people to discriminate unlawfully. This legislation, as I said earlier, presents challenges that other legislation doesn't present, because there are so many areas where to discriminate on grounds of age can have a positive impact, and that again ties into the fact that age is a continuum or a spectrum, and it can be appropriate at different stages in different people's lives to have age-related considerations. So quite a bit of work has been done on what areas might be included in that kind of situation. I mentioned one example around health, another around transport. So there are others that are potentially less clear-cut. For example, age-related holidays. Robin Allen and the Equality Commission and Children's Commissioner argue that unless there's a legitimate social aim underpinning an exception, then it shouldn't be included in the legislation. So again, there would have to be consideration of whether something like SAGA holidays or age-related holidays or 18 to 24 holidays would be a legitimate exception. It might be on consultation that a lot of people thought that probably it should be included. So again, there can be different opinions. So I would say there are some exceptions where it'll be much more easy to decide if it should be included. For example, where there's an existing policy or where there's an existing practice, for example, on transport and free transport. On the other hand, the argument against that is, should that money that's being provided to allow people over a certain age free transport, should that be ring-fenced, the potential income from that be excluded from use in some other part of the public service? So those are the kind of arguments that are looked at. So ministers have very clearly said that where there's a beneficial impact or potential beneficial impact, they would like to see those exceptions included. But again, those will have to be tested. So quite a lot of scoping work has been done to look at what those might be, including looking at the GB legislation and legislation that others have brought forward. It is a slight disadvantage to us that not many other countries have this legislation, and indeed the GB legislation isn't in place very long, so there hasn't been a lot of case law, there haven't been an awful lot of cases brought forward to test the law. So again, we are trying at this stage to explore as much as possible the policy considerations, and it might be that the legislation would try to capture the fact that only where there's a social aim to be achieved would there be an exception, but again there would be a requirement to define social aim, or it might be that the specific exceptions would be included. And I mentioned earlier the whole issue of objective justification, and then there's of course the possibility of genuine occupation requirement, where it might be that in certain circumstances, as in gender, if it was a requirement for a woman to carry out a particular role or a man because of privacy and confidentiality issues, it might be appropriate. There would be the opportunity to have genuine occupational requirements or genuine service occupational service exceptions there as well.
Okay, Chair, you may have asked this, I may have missed it, but do you have a timescale in terms of commencing consultation?
Again, not at the minute. We're aware of the fact that the legislative programme has a number of stages, and we would want to be consulting as early as possible, but I haven't today got an answer on that.
Are you sensing a high frustration amongst older people organisations and people who are concerned this legislation applies to all age groups in relation to the speed of delivery?
There have been various representations made to ministers. We are sensing yes, a degree of frustration from groups generally that there isn't more for them to look at present and to actually get involved in discussions on the policy proposal.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Will the consultation be the full 12 weeks?
Yes.
Thank you. Megan Fair.
Thank you, Patricia and David. It's just a question around the preparation work that you'd spoken about, obviously, to inform the public consultation, and you said that the consultation should be bringing all together the key issues of the whole debate, I suppose. But it's just in terms of the preliminary work that has been done with the departments around checking what implications it would have for them and all the rest of it. But what scope has that work been done under with the department? So, I mean, if for health, have they been going and looking into older people's issues, or have they been looking at it on the whole?
There was work done some time ago, and as I said to the Chair at the outset, in terms of preparing for this, there's been quite a bit of preliminary work done where departments were asked to look at what existing legislation they had in place that might be affected by this legislation, and to look generally at how their departments could be affected by this. So in terms of how that was interpreted, and we're going back a number of months and maybe longer, at the time it was, as I understand it, a general request to consider the potential implications. How they did it hasn't necessarily been determined by us. I do know many of the returns we have had back from departments, particularly in terms of legislation that be affected, it will have affected considered legislation that affects people of any age. They haven't necessarily started to try and work out whether or not this particular legislation would be included in the scope of our legislation or not. They've just come back with everything that might be affected. So when those initial discussions were being held, I think they were being held on a very general and open basis.
So in terms of the overall preparation work that's being done for the department, then what scope is it being done under?
Really, the point of the discussions is to, and they're being carried out on a without prejudice basis, is to ask departments to look at what the potential implications of the legislation would be for them, and to ask them then to think about it. Because I think nearly the worst thing that could happen would be that this legislation is brought in, and suddenly after it's brought in, people then begin to think about what the implications are. So this is as much to inform departments about the outworkings, potential outworkings of the legislation, and then to allow them to use their knowledge of their functions to think about what's going to be the implications, and is there anything in particular then you need to come forward with as an exception or as an area that needs to be examined. Because the legislation will work on the basis that anything that isn't included as an exception is covered, and that's in a way what we're asking departments to do. And if the legislation comes in and there's an area that hasn't been thought about, well, then we'll have the kind of scenario that the Chair outlined, that it'll be in the hands of the courts. So departments have been asked for it on that basis, but they haven't been asked to start differentiating they've been asked to look at it in their own terms and in terms of how they see the issues affecting them.
Okay, and you're talking about the legislation, but obviously what I'm getting at is that the age scope hasn't been decided yet. So when departments are going away to look at what implications it might have, or any departments coming back and just deciding that this is probably going to be to apply just to older people, or are they looking at what implications have for younger people as well? It's really to see if we are on a tight time scale, if the proper preparation work has been done for consultation.
We have been working on a very open basis with departments, which is we tell them the possible implications and we ask them to look at the possible implications. The work that has been done to date and, as I said, the legislation that they have identified has come back and it's across age ranges that may or may not be included in the legislation. So again, at this stage, there is a danger that consideration will be given to areas that won't ultimately be included in the legislation. Equally, there's a danger that those areas won't be looked at now until firm decisions have been made. But again, we aren't being prescriptive with departments. We are really using this as an awareness-raising issue for them, because ultimately they are the ones who will be able to tell us the impact of the legislation, and we can't, without a detailed knowledge of every single department and how it operates and how it delivers its services, we can't reach that conclusion. So it's trying, for the purposes of this legislation, which will be an executive bill and which will cover all of the departments except where there are specific exceptions, we are therefore trying to get to a position where they are fully appraised, fully aware of the potential issues, but we haven't been prescriptive about that, and again, it's for them to really think about that.
Do you not think it would be best if you were prescriptive, though?
Because decisions haven't been made, we're not in the position at the minute to be prescriptive. So departments are aware that decisions haven't been made, and they are aware that the two issues that the two possible scenarios that I've indicated are possible, that either they could spend quite a bit of time looking at areas that might not be included, or they could not consider those in any great detail now but have to revisit them at a later stage, which will put pressure on later on in the process. But because decisions haven't been taken, that's really the best approach we can take at the minute, I think.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it from the members. Just to complete here, Patricia, you mentioned the work of Robin Allen QC, who gave evidence to the committee, along with the Commissioner for Children and Younger People, the Quality Commission, who between them gave us a joint paper. What engagement have you had with them on their paper?
Well, the paper was provided to us. We have read their paper. We have been involved at the meetings with ministers on the paper. So the engagement we've had with them has been very much through that ministerial route.
So have you actually sat down with them and discussed it?
As officials?
Yeah.
No.
I've got to say, I think that's extraordinary. And the reason I'm saying that is I'm looking at your risk register. Mm-hmm. And you have 3 risks. And your mitigation is engagement with key stakeholders for the first one, and early engagement with key stakeholders in the third one. Are these people stakeholders? The Equality Commission, the Children's Commissioner?
Although we haven't sat down with them, we have read the paper, we have read the opinion, we are very, very clear what their views are.
Sorry, are they stakeholders in your view?
Yes, they are stakeholders.
And how are you defining engagement then? Reading a paper?
Well, engagement and consultation. We haven't gone to formal consultation. Inevitably, once we have clear decisions taken on what will be in that consultation, that will give us the opportunity to have discussions with the Equality Commission and others that we would like to have. But I think the important thing is that we understand what their opinion is. We've got information from them.
Sorry, Patricia, the important thing is that your mitigation actions are engagement. And as I understand the English language, we are engaging by dialogue.
Yes.
Reading a paper you send me is a pretty thin definition of engagement.
We engage in different ways. The purpose of consultation and the purpose of engagement is to understand the perspective that's being offered, to understand the viewpoints, to understand where people are coming from. And I think as far as possible in these in this area, we have done that. And I think although we haven't sat down as officials with the Quality Commission, we have been involved in the meetings with ministers, and we have engaged at that level with ministers. So I think I would say as an official that if a minister is engaging and I'm party to that discussion, I get as much information out of that as I would, because the Commission is there, the Commission's giving their very strong views, arguing the different issues, and I can understand, and having participated and been present at those meetings, that's as much engagement on the issues as I really need. The fact that I'm not chairing or conducting the meeting itself doesn't really get in the way of understanding what the issues are and being fully engaged with them in that respect. Is it as much engagement as you need? Is it as much engagement as your stakeholders need? Well, the Commission, I would argue that if the Commission is getting to meet ministers and to present their opinions to ministers, that's probably better than meeting officials, because they have the ear of the decision makers. Let's take a look at the risks. 3 risks. Number 1, the risk is political and/or public opposition to the proposals. The probability of this happening on a scale of 0 to 5, where 5 is disastrous, you're scoring 5, and the impact, where 5 is disastrous, is 5. So there's a perfect storm there. Number 2, crowded legislative timetable delays primary legislation. Probability 4, impact 5. Your mitigation actions, plan to ensure the primary is introduced as early as possible in the legislative programme. Forward planning and preparation to minimise the impact of any delays, and develop subordinate legislation in parallel. The third risk is a delay at committee stage. 3 out of 5 probability, but the impact again is the top score of 5. Your mitigation is maintain effective working relationships.
early engagement with key stakeholders to minimise adverse presentations to the committee, and develop any necessary subordinate legislation in parallel. What does early engagement with key stakeholders to minimise adverse presentations mean?
It means that when we have agreed decisions taken, that we engage as early as possible with stakeholders. Because we're not in a position to do that yet, we haven't done it. There is still time in the legislative programme and in the consultation process to do that. We intend, as I indicated, and ministers intend to have a full 12-week consultation. As part of that, we would intend to have a rigorous and detailed consultation with as many groups as we can, with the Equality Commission, with the Children's Commissioner and with others. So it's not, I would argue, a perfect storm just yet, because we still have, in the time available before the end of the mandate, the possibility to take forward or to address most of those issues, preventing the negative presentations to the committee. That maybe hasn't been something that has been mitigated through those representations and those engagements. But again, the fact that ministers, junior ministers, have met at least twice now with the Commissioner for Children and Young People and with the Equality Commission, I think indicates a willingness to listen to the issues and to be challenged on the issues. And I don't think I'm betraying any confidence to say that there were robust discussions and there were very strong points of view made by all of those parties making representations to ministers.
Final question. We're 2 years, I think, from the end of the mandate. Obviously, you'll not get the consultation out before the summer. We will be the scrutiny committee. Is your confidence that you'll get this over the line during this mandate based on the fact that the committee will do the scrutiny within the minimum period? Because I wouldn't be confident that we wouldn't need an extension.
We have based our achievement of the legislation in the mandate by working back and, by and large, by looking at minimum timescales, yes.
Minimum timescales?
By and large. So,
including the committee? Are we in the by or the large?
You're probably in the which one? The by. We are hoping that.
Sorry, just to be clear, Patricia, you're basing it on us doing it in the 30 days, the minimum.
Well, we have allowed for what would be regarded as the minimum timescales. Even with minimum timescales, there can be some time freed up in the process. So we would be hoping that we would have enough time that if the committee did need extra time or require extra time, that there might be some leeway. But it is very, very tight and very, very challenging, yes, to do it in that way.
Well, we've recognised it in the timetables that there may be a need for an extension.
Okay. David, Patricia, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
That was a bit of a waste of time, wasn't it?
Well, given the remaining difficulties about the scope of the legislation, I wouldn't be confident there'll be a statute this mandate. But there we go. Does anybody wish to comment on?
I'm just disappointed that we're not getting the nub of the under 18s. It's not. I mean, because I've spoke recently to Pensioners Parliament, so I'm fully aware that older people obviously dearly want legislation, but I don't think it's fair that the department would appear to be putting a wedge in between any sector out there. And if some people are then coming to the view that, well, even if somebody has a school, can you keep us in? That's an unfair position to put people in. And it's an unfortunate position for us to be in as well, and it's a position I don't want to be in.
Mm-hmm. Well, this, if you remember, with the cruise and the fishing boats, that we were legislating for some in the EEA rather than the EEC, I think. We need to get to the ministers, Alex, I think.
Aye.
Okay, members. Item 7, that's a briefing from departmental officials on the Executive's response to the PEDU report on the flooding of 2012. Page 89 of your packs is the clerk's brief. Following that, there's a copy of the Executive response, which is page 91, and a copy of the recommendations from the report is at page 96. Can I welcome to committee Julie Cumming, Keith Jagelman and Alan Maitland.
Chair, committee members, thank you very much. I'm Alan Maitland, OFMDFM. I'm Director of HR and Corporate Services. I hope you don't mind the shirt sleeves. Thank you very much.
No, you're all right.
I'm plastered up, but if you hear a clunk, it's probably me. So can I introduce my colleagues? One of the important functions of my division is civil contingencies, and Keith is the head of that policy branch, and his deputy is Julie Cumming. So, with your permission, I'll hand over to Keith. He will provide some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Chair, members. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to come and brief you today on the PEDU report on the June 2012 flooding. Members will be aware of the background to that. Following the June 2012 flooding, the Executive commissioned the Performance and Efficiency Delivery Unit, PEDU, to carry out a review of the response to that flooding and to make recommendations to the Executive as to how things might be improved. And we sent a link to that full PEDU report to the committee under letter date at the 7th of April, which hopefully you've had the opportunity to consider. The vast majority of the recommendations in that committee actually were for other departments to take forward. However, the one that did fall to OFMDFM to consider related to the formalisation of local government's role in civil contingencies matters, and to include in that consideration the extension of local civil contingency structures across the region. Following consideration of this recommendation, the Department obtained Executive approval on the 27th of February of this year for a number of measures to enhance civil contingencies measures at that local level. These provided for a number of key points. The establishment of 4 additional sub-regional civil emergencies preparedness groups, which between them will cover the region outside of the Greater Belfast area. That area already being covered by an existing emergency preparedness group in the form of Belfast Resilience. Secondly, the establishment of a civil contingencies group, and I'll come to that, the civil contingencies group, in a moment. A subgroup of civil contingencies group to oversee the work of those emergency planning groups, including the Belfast group. And the establishment of a civil contingencies group work stream to identify the need, or the second need really in the recommendation, to formalise that District Council civil contingencies role and to consider how this might be done. This work will consider the need for wider civil contingencies legislation. And finally then, the presentation of a draft Memorandum of Understanding to Local Government Emergency Management Group, which permission of the committee I will refer here to after as LGEM, and the Civil Contingencies Group, for agreement to set out how councils should discharge their civil contingencies role at the sub-regional level, and also how Civil Contingencies Group member organisations should support councils in the execution of that role. This department continues to work with stakeholders, and a very wide group of stakeholders it is, to implement those arrangements. Given the scale and impact of certain emergencies, it is important that that organisations work together to prepare at the regional level as well as the local level. That was the primary concern of that recommendation I've been speaking about. The Civil Contingencies Group, CCG, operates at that regional level and is the principal strategic emergency preparedness body for the public sector. The group is chaired by the head of the civil service and is facilitated by this department. It comprises senior representation from the departments and their agencies, from the emergency services and from district councils. In taking their work forward, CCG members agree and oversee the delivery of priority work to enhance our collective capability to prepare for a range of emergencies here. This forms the basis of a CCG work programme over which they have governance and which continues to develop in response to identified need. Arrangements for coordinating preparedness for and response to emergencies at or near the border are in place at local sub-regional level by the emergency services and by other agencies. Indeed, one of the functions of the new emergency preparedness groups is that where relevant they should liaise and coordinate with emergency planning arrangements and structures in the border counties in Ireland. In addition to the preparedness measures outlined, there are also well-established and tested structures and protocols at regional and local level for responding to all types of emergencies. These have been used to very good effect in recent times. I'm pleased to report during the coastal flooding emergency in January 2014, which was of considerable concern to a large number of people, as well as the response to what we've coined the spring blizzard in March 2013, where the Northern Ireland Central Crisis Management Arrangements were invoked. They're used for the most serious types of emergency and led by OFMDFM. And the Civil Contingencies Group were convened under those arrangements in emergency mode to deal with the worst impacts of that. The philosophy we have, though, is very much one of continuous improvement. So there's no suggestion that we rest on our laurels, having had good outputs, if you like, from the response that has been made to most recent emergencies. So in line with established best practice, a multi-agency debrief is held following any emergency response or any multi-agency exercise to test our capabilities. For example, after that spring blizzard last March, OFMDFM hosted a debrief involving all of the CCG member organisations to capture learning from that emergency, and there were a number of key learning points to be gleaned from that. Those points have subsequently been used then to further increase our capability in dealing with future emergencies. In the same vein, we in OFMDFM, given our central role in civil contingencies, will continue to work with stakeholders through the auspices of CCG to strengthen our collective capability, also to deal with emergencies as they arise. Chair, I don't want to speak for too long. I mean, that is a summary of where we are in terms of the PEDU recommendation specifically, which is what the committee has asked about, and some of the context within which that sits. Obviously, now we'd be very interested to hear any observations or comments the committee may have. I'm very happy to answer any questions. Okay, appreciate that. Thank you very much. I think one of the first things you mentioned was the sub-regional civil preparedness groups. Yes. 4, I believe, to supplement Belfast. Have they been established? In the process of that at the moment, what we have established is that an oversight group that will oversee the work of those 5, the 4 additionals plus Belfast, to determine how best they might be established. I mean, it's very much an issue, not so much for OFMDFM in this case, but for the local stakeholders to take forward, primarily but not exclusively local government, but also PSNI and a small number of other key stakeholders. Did you have a timeline for the establishment of these groups when you reported? Specifically, no. But what was widely recognised was that there was an urgency in the establishment of these groups. The negotiations around what they might do, what they might look like, what the borders of each of these groups might be, has been a fairly extended process and a difficult one at times. But we've arrived where we are with the recommendations the Executive have now approved. There was a general acceptance, though, that this was something that was needed and was needed to be put in place as quickly as possible following Executive approval. Okay, but you published in September 2012. It's now very nearly May 2014, and these 4 groups are not yet up and running, and we've had 2 major incidents in the meantime. Yes, indeed. As I say, it was recognised that it was a matter of urgency, but it was important too to get it right. There were a lot of different ideas as to what these groups might look like, what size they might be, what their role might be, how they might be governed. how they would interface with the Civil Contingencies Group, looking at that regional strategic level. So there were a lot of considerations and a lot of stakeholders involved in terms of our bilaterals and multilateral meetings with them, trying to reach that level of agreement.
I do accept that, but I want to come back to you on the importance of getting it right.
Yes.
Do you ever actually get it right? Or do you get it as good as you can get it at any given time and continuously improve it?
I think,
which is your culture by your own
absolutely, and I think it is a mixture of that. I mean, obviously we strive to get it right first time.
Well, you can't get it right if you don't have it up and running. That's the frustration, Keith.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think, you know, there was little point in us trying to rush something through which wasn't going to work or wasn't going to have the buy-in from stakeholders. We needed to have a high degree of assurance that we would have that for the thing to work at the ground level. So that was an important consideration. It's something we had to spend a fair bit of time on, perhaps, as you're suggesting, Chair, perhaps a bit longer than we would have liked. We hope we've got it right. Time will tell if we have. As I say, we're in the throes of establishing these groups now. Once they're up and running, we have to test whether we have got it right or not. Stakeholders will still be engaged in terms of their view as to whether or not they feel that it's working. Are there adjustments need to be made? And if that's the case, we'll certainly have to take that on board and, if necessary, go back to ministers with some review of those arrangements. I'm actually fairly confident, and I certainly hope that we will not need to do that because the key stakeholders have very much signed up to this and are very keen to now to make this work.
And has everybody signed the Memorandum of Understanding?
Not as yet, no. We have sought the agreement of all the stakeholders, that is to say the CCG-NI members, as well as local government.
Has anybody signed it?
Well, everyone will sign at the same time. What we have arranged is that the Local Government Emergency Management Group will sign on behalf of the existing 26 district councils, and that the chairman of CCG will sign on behalf of all other member organisations of CCG.
So are you moving forward at the speed of the slowest?
Inevitably there's a degree of that, Chair, unfortunately. We need both of those signatures, obviously, before we can get that in place. It is a priority for us, though. We must have that in place because once we do that, that will give us the space to take forward the next piece of work, which is the consideration of the legislation and you know, what that might look like and whether indeed there's a need for that.
I believe I'm correct in saying that the Regional Development Minister made an offer previously with regard to better coordination of flood response, and I see in your report at paragraph 72 a key structural reason behind the question of who should be lead government department for flooding incidents arises because Rivers Agency is in DARD, Regional Agriculture and Rural Development, while the Road Service and NI Water are within DRD Regional Development. In this context, it's recommended consideration is given to the consolidation of all flood response organisations under one departmental ambit, i.e. by the transfer of Rivers Agency from DARD to DRD. It's my understanding DRD are content with that. I believe your target for that was within 2012.
The target set by PEDU was 2012, yes, and I'm aware that discussions have taken place between DRD and DARD on that matter, but it's not a matter for OFMDFM, and so I can't comment on where we currently are with that.
Well, you know, people who are subject to floods, in my experience, and I do have experience of this in Newton Arts, become incredibly frustrated when you get what they believe to be the relevant officials, and in some cases ministers, looking at a problem. Everybody agrees, and I've had this experience, 2 government departments, a council and the housing executive, all agreeing this is a problem. Some people starting to say, here's the solution, here's an alternative solution, but when you say who's in charge, all 4 step back. People, Heath, with respect, don't care. They want solutions. They want joined-up government.
Yeah, I understand, Chair. I mean, I do appreciate that is the situation out there. However, this particular recommendation was for DARD and DRD to take forward. rather than OFMDFM.
Well, actually, you've got a by whom at the bottom of that paragraph, and it does say OFMDFM stroke DARD stroke DRD, so you are giving OFMDFM a role, paper.
Well, sorry, this was the PEDU report that put the by whom, and they mistakenly put us in there as a stakeholder in that consideration.
Oh, so that's an error.
That's an error on their part.
By PEDU.
Yes.
You'll need to be PEDU'd.
I don't want
Deputy
to
Chair,
very
Chris
often, but anyway.
Thanks, Chair. The flooding, the serious flooding that required the PEDU report was in June 2012.
Yes.
Right. And I recall, because it affected my own constituency, East Belfast, quite severely. I think the estimate is that there were around 80% of floodline calls were abandoned. So that system failed on that occasion. January 2013, the Red Cross, who are doing some fantastic humanitarian aid work here in Northern Ireland, to the point I've been quite startled by how active they are required to be in Northern Ireland. I think the perception of Red Cross is it's an international aid organisation, but they're doing some fantastic work here in Northern Ireland around times of emergencies. They produced a call to action for civil contingencies legislation in January 2013. In January 2014, the First Minister said that he had an official's report indicating that legislation should be passed in the Assembly to require and place a duty on councils regarding civil contingency planning. He said that he supported this and that he was going to look into having it done. Obviously, now we're almost in May 2014. Can you provide us an update in relation to the delivery of civil contingencies legislation, and perhaps I should say civil contingencies legislation, for example, in GB was brought forward in 2004 and seems to have two key elements where it puts a requirement on responders to come together every 6 months. I imagine that might look like those sub-regional civil emergency preparedness groups, for example, and it places clear duties on those responders to deliver on, duties to assess risk, maintain emergency plans, communicate with the public, etc. So there seems to be some good evidence and calls for the delivery of such legislation, and indeed I think there is included in recommendations of the PEDU report. So where are we in relation to that issue?
Well, you've mentioned three issues there, if I might just touch on each of them, Mr Little. First of all, that flood line and the performance of the flood incident line during the June 2012 flooding. That was indeed one of the improvements that was identified that needed to be addressed urgently. And indeed, through the auspices of CCG&I, it was. And what we have in place now is a very much augmented flood incident line, and I hope I'm not tempting fate when I say that we're in a much better position now through the efforts of Department of Finance and personnel who took this forward, so that we will not have a repetition of the issues that arose from the flood incident line during that particular flooding emergency. In terms of British Red Cross, absolutely would agree. They've been extremely active and extremely helpful operationally to the various flood incidents and emergency incidents there have been in recent times, and without whom I'm sure the response that was made across the piece would not have been as effective. So we very much welcome the work and the contribution that the British Red Cross make in that regard. In terms of the legislation, where we are at the moment is, and I appreciate what you're saying about the legislation that exists in other jurisdictions. Our understanding is that the decision was taken not to have a piece of legislation that equated to CCA, so the Civil Contingencies Act here in Northern Ireland, as I think there were some issues around the fit with arrangements for devolution here. However, ministers at that time were very much seized of the need to provide to the public here a level of protection and a level of emergency response which meets their needs and meets their expectations. So in that context then, the Northern Ireland Framework for Civil Contingencies was developed and agreed. That sets out how public sector organisations should discharge their civil contingencies responsibilities. It built on At that time, and by that I mean by 2005, it built on existing good practice in terms of policy for civil contingencies and reflected a number of other developments that were current at that time, including some of the principles, at least, that were contained within the Civil Contingencies Act itself. So, to that extent, ministers addressed that need, put in place that framework to which departments adhere in terms of delivery of their own functions, and I include their agencies in that. So, while we haven't got legislation that, as you say, equates or looks like the Civil Contingencies Act, we do have that provision in place since 2005. What the Executive has now agreed, though, is partly to ask us to look at this again in terms of legislative provision. First of all, in the context of formalising the civil contingencies role for local government, but also to consider more widely the need for legislation, and that's a piece of work that will be taken forward under the auspices of the Civil Contingencies Group. It will be a multi-agency effort. We need to consider this with all of our stakeholders, and it will be taken, as I say, through CCG itself. We need to identify, first of all, what the problem is, and I know BRC have been vociferous in their support of the introduction of legislation here, and I know other stakeholders have been similarly keen for consideration to be given to this matter. But we do need to be clear what the problem is that we are seeking to resolve. Having done that, we need to be clear how best we might resolve that problem, and we need to be clear whether legislation is the appropriate mechanism to do that. That's the thought process we need to go through with regard to this. The outcome obviously is unknown at the moment. Legislation is expensive, it's resource intensive, it takes a fair bit of time. If there's a problem that's been identified and can be fixed in another way, there's certainly an argument that we should do that. If, however, it is a problem that can be fixed only by the introduction of legislation, well, then clearly that's a route we would need to consider.
We are a legislature. But concerning in 2014 that we're still using phrases like we need to identify what the problem is, given the number of incidents that we've had and the reports that have been done. I'm willing to stand corrected, but I suppose I refer to my opening remarks that the First Minister himself has said that he has an official's report indicating that legislation should be passed to require and place a duty on councils regards civil contingency planning. Are you aware of that report?
I was aware of that report.
Okay, and is that being acted on then?
That's really being taken forward in the context of the executive decision that I've mentioned.
I mean, if I can just add, I think what Keith is saying is that we want to keep an open mind on how. I think the problem is what the issues are in terms of the need for legislation or not, and on that we'd want to keep an open mind and explore all positions.
Okay.
Were you not indicating that the First Minister has made up his mind?
It sounds, yeah. My understanding is also the First Minister said that I support that and think that we're going to have a look at it. My understanding is that was in January 2014.
So if the Minister has made up his mind, why do officials have an open mind?
OFMDFM have put the departmental position to the Executive, and the Executive agreed what the Department wants to do by way of taking forward consideration of that legislation, and it is as I outlined earlier.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, just one last question then. So it's an executive. There's a need for executive decision making around this then? Is that what you're saying?
The decision by the Executive was in terms of how this should be taken forward, or what should be done in a response to the PEDU report, and that's what they've decided needs to be done, bearing in mind that it was the Executive that commissioned that PEDU report in the first instance.
But the head of the Civil Service, head of OFMDFM, is head of the Civil Contingencies Group.
Yes,
Yeah.
he chairs it, yes.
Okay, and it seems, maybe we can seek clarity, but my understanding is that the First Minister has a view in relation to this, and it was put forward in January 2014, so I just think there's a bit of a concern there in terms of timescales for further decision making and action in relation to that. You also say that you're engaging with stakeholders in relation to these issues.
Yes.
What does that entail, and who are those stakeholders?
Well, it will certainly be a series of bilateral meetings, probably one or two, or how many we need in terms of multi-agency engagements with stakeholders. By stakeholders I mean the departments, the emergency services and local government primarily. And really, it goes back to the point you mentioned there a moment ago about what the problem is, and we do need to start there. And we're not saying there is not a problem, but what we are saying is we need to understand what it is, because we are also getting reports from other stakeholders and from the public saying that the response, for example, to the spring blizzard in March 2013 was extremely effective. Now, that's not to say some people didn't suffer greatly from that. They certainly did, and there are always lessons to be learned. But generally, the impression was that that was an extremely effective multi-agency response to that emergency, and so therefore we feel with the feedback from that, and indeed from the January 14 potential flooding, which thankfully didn't happen as much as we had feared it might, again a very positive response to that, and so we feel that with all the arrangements we have put in place, we are getting it right. And I say we, I mean collectively all of the stakeholders, all of the emergency planners and responders across the region, and so in the light of that, you might wonder, what is the problem that's being put forward as something that needs to be resolved by legislation? We need to understand what that is, and that's what we intend to do, and then determine from there how we address that problem and how best we can.
There's at least one official who thinks a solution is civil contingencies legislation, then, according to the First Minister. Is it possible to have access to the report that makes that recommendation?
I'm not actually aware of what that report is. But I can certainly have a look to see if there is some sort of formal report that he was referring to.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Leslie Cree.
Thanks, Chair. Whenever I saw this template, I thought this looks familiar. Is there not in existence a disaster committee or set up which covers the same format really as this? Are you aware of that?
In terms, do you mean of the emergency preparedness groups, or in terms of civil contingencies group?
And it was set up, I think, and it's going back a wee bit now, to do with local disasters. For example, an air crash or whatever else.
Yes.
There is a format very similar to what I have read here, with various bodies involved.
Yes.
Are you aware of that?
It's conceivable that it was maybe a forerunner of what I've described. Certainly we revamped, if that's the right word, Civil Contingencies Group quite extensively back in November 2012, and very much reinforced the role that it has in terms of governance and in terms of representation. And it may be that what you have in mind, I simply don't know, but it may be what you have in mind is the forerunner to that. In other words, pre the changes we made in November 12.
I'm not sure either, but they used to organise drills and everything else, so it was very much a live organisation, and it did involve all of the statutory services.
Yes, I don't know.
It
Depends how far back it goes. I mean, it may go back even as far as civil defence type arrangements that were abandoned in this region some time ago.
The airports were involved, for example, things like that.
Yeah, it does sound like it's very much along the lines of the role that CCG now has.
Well, just looking at this, as other members have said, two years down the road, I would be more concerned about what has been actually done on the ground to interpret what actually went wrong, the causes of it, if we know what they are, and the implementation of resolutions to those things. Has any work been done on that?
There's been a lot of work. I mean, I take it you're talking about the June 2012. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, As with any, as I mentioned earlier, as with any emergency, there's a multi-agency debrief conducted, which looks at, in standard format really, what went well, what didn't go so well, and what could be improved for next time, which is this sort of standard format, if you like, for a multi-agency debrief. That was conducted on this occasion for the 2012 flooding. There were a number of recommendations coming out of that debrief report, which were adopted either by LGEM to take forward at that local or sub-regional level, but also for CCG to take forward at that more regional stroke strategic level. And there were a number of recommendations that were adopted for the work programme for each of those two bodies.
Do you know if any capital projects came out of that?
Not aware of any capital projects, no. What they tend to be is really a refining or an enhancement of existing arrangements. That's not to say new arrangements would not be potentially put in place as well. But my recollection of what came out of the 12 flooding was, certainly for CCG and I, a review of a number of the protocols that we use for responding both at the local level and at the regional level, and also how the response might be escalated from that local level to the strategic level when it needs to be. There were issues around the role of lead government departments as well, I think, around that time, which also we needed to clarify, and we have done that through amendments to those protocols.
No, I was thinking more preventative measures, for example, like improving various water courses, improving storm drains, many of which go back to Victorian times.
Yeah.
Obvious things that need to be done.
This is something that is considered, I believe, on a fairly constant basis by primarily DRD and DARD, who are the owners of the infrastructure. And I know that they were that was one of the other recommendations coming out of the PEGI report, was that they look at the flooding infrastructure to determine what might be done to improve that and how it might be prioritised. But again, it would be DRD and DARD who would be able to advise further on that.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Okay, can I just finish by asking about two or three of the recommendations? Paragraph 89 said exercise Illuvies or Illuvies was scheduled for a rerun 2014.
What is that?
Given the experience of June 12.
Yeah, it's a great name.
Given the experience of June 12, it's recommended consideration is given to running the next exercise sooner, and that tests and exercises should be held more frequently until evidence of improved responses in real situations is evident.
Yeah.
Has that all been done?
That has been done. DARD led on that, and we had that exercise in November 2013, if memory serves. Around 150 to 200, I think, in fact, delegates attended that, and it was regarded to be very successful. A lot of learning points come from that as well, which are being taken forward by various agencies.
Okay, paragraph 92, to make use of the momentum given to this issue by recent floods, it's recommended the relevant lead departments come together to produce a consolidated action plan for all of the report's recommendations for implementing the improved flood defence framework.
Yes. Rivers Agency within DARD took that work forward.
Okay. Paragraph 93. It's also recommended PEGU should review the consolidated action plan and report on its implementation to the Executive in March 13.
Yes. I believe that was done, but I believe it was July 2013 before that report was put to the Executive.
Okay. To anybody who might be reading the evidence, Keith, or listening in on the internet, can you say to them, hand on heart, that PEGU performance and efficiency based, which was reported 20 months ago, has made a difference, should there be an emergency today or tomorrow?
I do think it has. I mean, I genuinely do think it has. It's not just us that were working on this. We had only really one of the recommendations that needed to be taken forward. I am aware of the vast amount of work that other agencies have also taken forward in response to the sort of recommendations that you picked out there, Chair, and certainly I'm aware from my own experience and my dealings with those agencies that a fair bit of work has been done. We certainly have done a lot. We have now got the Executive approval for the implementation of the emergency preparedness groups, and I genuinely believe they will make a significant difference.
Okay, George Robinson would like to.
Thanks, Chair. Chair, I've listened to
quite a bit of the debate between yourselves and so forth. And from the officials' point of view, I think they've given us a fairly good resume of what has happened. Things may have been a bit slow at the beginning, but there seems to be fair progress, and I think we should leave it to the officials and let them get on with it. I know it's a very, very important topic, and I mean, I've had it in quite a lot of flooding in my area, but I'm more reassured now after I've heard, most of what you've told us, that there is progress, in my opinion, good progress. And I think we should, as a committee, we should let the officials get on with it.
Thank you for your comments.
Okay. As a final question, can I ask what other issues fall within your remit in terms of the Civil Contingencies branch?
But it's really about promoting the civil contingencies agenda, across the public sector here. So we have responsibility for putting in place policies, advice, guidance on good practice. There's a suite of that sort of material on our website and is made known to our stakeholders, as well as a suite of protocols that we've developed as a result, primarily, of responding to a number of emergencies over the last 5 or 6 years, I suppose, and updating those regularly. So that's really where our role is. We don't have lead government department responsibility for any particular sector like flooding or fuel resilience or whatever the case may be, and so rather it is that more strategic oversight of the policy framework and the guidance framework within which our stakeholders should operate.
Okay, Keith, Julie and Alan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And just to complete this section, given the role of Rivers Agency, NI Water, Road Service, are you content we forward the departmental correspondence of the 7th of April regarding PEDU to the Committee for Agriculture and Rural Development and also the Committee for Regional Development for info?
Agreed.
Yep.
Thank you. Members, item 8 is a consideration of the responses we've received to our request for written evidence on our inquiry into the Barroso Task Force. In terms of reference, threefold: consider the work and structures of the task force, including the working group since its inception in 2007. Secondly, identifying the outcomes from the task force and assessing that against objectives. And finally, to identify and consider lessons learned from the functioning of the task force in order to inform recommendations for any future engagement in EU affairs post-Barroso. So far, we've had 10 written responses. We're expecting at any time a response from the European Commission. Page 100 of your pack, you'll find the clerk's brief, which gives a summary of the responses. The responses themselves start at page 104. And in your tabled pack at page 7, we have the response from the Department for Regional Development. What I'm wondering, members, is I think we did agree this would not be a kind of long and particularly burdensome inquiry. Do members wish to receive any oral evidence from any of the stakeholders? Or would we be content that the committee staff take the full set of responses and work them up into a paper?
I think that would be the best way.
That's a good idea, yeah.
And then we might consider bringing forward a take-note debate at some point in the future.
Okay.
Yeah? Content? Thank you very much indeed. Forward work programme at page 149. It takes us through to the end of the session. Just to say, we were due to have a briefing on the Executive's EU priorities for 2014-15 today. That was cancelled on the 17th of April, and the offer is to have a briefing on the 2nd of July. Now, I have to say, these are priorities for financial year 2014-15, which we're well into, and it's July before we're even going to get a chance to take a look. Members have any other comments? Okay, we had also, if you remember, there had been some talk of holding a meeting at the Crumlin Road prison site. We've been offered a date of the 4th of June. I have to say, members, I'm not sure whether there's a specific reason for doing it, and there are cost implications, resource getting the room, getting the recording equipment, microphones in. Not going to die in the ditch either way. Any thoughts?
I think it's always beneficial if, in going to a site, there are other additional reasons for being at the site. So it might be something that we return to.
I think, if we're self-aware, we might admit we're not going to pull a crowd on our own.
On a different thing, next week, we have the Victims and Survivors Service Board next week. And I see there are the chair of the board due to come up. What about the chief executive? Is the chief executive due to come in?
Have we got the names yet?
I've got names yet, no.
The names of officials haven't been confirmed yet.
Are you keen?
See any point in the chief executive here, to be honest with you?
Well, I think because one of the issues, not least in the independent assessment, was that the board wasn't in place as soon as would have been ideal. Our original intention was to get the chair of the board, but you're obviously keen that the chief exec comes.
I think it's essential because the chair is not that long in position, and the issues that had to be addressed precede the chair, and some of them I think are still extant. So,
well, does anybody differ, or shall we request that the chief exec accompanies the chair? A specific request. Yeah. All content?
Yeah.
The only other point, members, in terms of the forward work programme was a potential visit to Brussels. Seems to me it's going to be the autumn earliest. I can't see us doing anything between now and recess, if we're all content. In which case, any other business? If not, by the way, sorry, I did mean to mention, Clark and I had a briefing today from 3 groups with regard to asylum seekers, refugees. We're going to put papers in the packs for next week. Again, there was a thought of maybe trying to get some sort of a debate before recess to coincide with, it's Refugees Week? Yeah. Is 16th of June. Now, apparently we can do that if we agree next week. Okay. But the papers, and it's only a 3 or 4 pager, but I think it would be, personally, I would like us to give it a fair wind if we can all agree. Okay, members, thank you. Next meeting, Wednesday, 7th of May, 2 p.m, room 30. We are adjourned.